The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Order. Just before I call the proposer of the motion, can I remind Honourable and Right Honourable members that there have been some changes to the procedure in here, and even if you have attended a Westminster Hall debate before today under the new rules, there have been changes to the change rules. In order to respect social distancing, if members can sit at these seats with ticks against them, there are more people on the order list than there are seats in the horseshoe. So I will only call members to speak if they're here at the start of the debate. And if members who've spoken wish to leave or move to the seats at the back, then they can do so. That's the only way that members can speak, because it is not allowed for members to speak from the public gallery. I'd also ask members to respect the one-way system and come in that door we're in and go out that door when they've finished. And if members could also sanitise their microphones in front of them. I think that's all the new rules. And I will call on Tonia Antoniazzi to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-Petitions 328754 and 306845 relating to financial rewards for government workers and key workers. Thank you, Mr Stringer, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship and an honour to lead for the Petitions Committee on this debate. As we come to the end of any year, we all start to reflect on the events of the last 12 months. The 2020 has been such an unprecedented year for everyone, and throughout the year we have seen examples of extraordinary contributions that have been made by so many, and in particular the role of our key workers. That has made our lives so much better throughout the pandemic. And I would like to put again on record my sincere thanks to all those who have worked hard and have given what was most needed when we needed it most. They have been invaluable. But it seems that despite warm words, the government does not seem to appreciate the work that so many have done for us. We clapped for them on our doorsteps, but turns out they aren't worth paying properly in recognition of their dedication. As we can see from the number of signatures on these two petitions, and indeed the sheer number of petitions on this issue, that there is a strong feeling across the country on how we should be rewarding people on the front line. During the summer, I had a phone call from my friend Mel's brother, a local refuse collector and union rep. He just wanted to tell me firsthand how his team had turned up throughout the pandemic and continue not to miss around. I am so proud of them, so proud of the efforts that people have made to keep our country going. Swansea Council and local authorities across the United Kingdom can be very proud of their workforce and how they have adapted to the challenges. And while Rob Stewart, the leader of Swansea Council, is looking at different ways to reward staff, his hands are tied financially. And also former colleagues of mine in the teaching profession in both England and Wales who have kept schools open for key workers' children describe to me the immense fatigue and pressure they are under from moving classrooms, carrying resources, increased planning and preparation in a job in which they feel deeply responsible about the learning and progression of our future generations. They are also on their knees. And when the Welsh Labour Government tried to reward workers in care homes with their £500 bonus earlier in the year, the Chancellor's Exchequer taxed them on it, and with those claiming universal credit suffering a double whammy. These are the poorest paid people in the public sector, and they took those hits again and again. And they look like they're going to do the same if the Scottish Government tried to give a thank you payment to their NHS staff as well. In response to the Honourable Member, indeed my honourable friend from Glasgow South West, who I am pleased to see in this debate, the Prime Minister said that he was lost in admiration for the efforts of our civil servants, whether in DWP, HMRC or the Treasury. If we think about the furloughing scheme, everybody said it was impossible and far too complicated, and that we would never get that cash into people's pockets. But they did it within 4 weeks. That is a fantastic tribute to the work of our civil service, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart. The words from the Prime Minister. Well, following the Chancellor's spending review announcement that there will be a pay freeze for all public sector workers, I suspect that civil service servants won't be feeling the Prime Minister's admiration so much as lost. This further pay freeze has come after public sector workers have already been punished by a decade of pay freezes and increased workload. I know I was one of them. And I'm sure we will hear from the Minister about the difference in public and private sector pay. But we know that once workforce characteristics such as experience and educational attainment are taken into account, there is close to a 0% difference in pay. And undoubtedly, we will hear about fairness for those working in the private sector, and I wholeheartedly agree that they should be treated with fairness. But this is and should not be a race to the bottom. We should be bringing pay in the private sector up to a standard that makes all work pay, as the Conservatives are wont to say. The Minister will probably talk about the value for money for taxpayers, but guess what? Public sector workers pay their taxes too. And if this government doesn't think that the work that has been done by civil servants, by nurses, by the police, by the fire service, by work coaches, by border force, by refuse collectors, by workers in the justice system, by our armed forces, by teachers, and by all of those who have faced the biggest challenge and who have put themselves on the front line in fighting this pandemic, is worthy of a pay rise, then they should say so. And I'll wait for the government line to be trotted out about the poorest paid being rewarded. If they were being rewarded in any meaningful way, I would welcome this announcement. But as with all of these things, the devil is in the detail. A pay rise of £250 for those earning under £24,000 a year is equivalent to just £4.80 a week, and that's before tax. So in terms of a take-home pay, about enough for mince pies, 2 pints of milk and some tea bags. What a Christmas bonus for them. Just one look at the civil service campaign here for you shows what a resilient and adaptive workforce we have in our civil servants. The defence equipment workers who have been overseeing staffing of the Nightingale hospitals, the Driver Vehicle Standards Agency who work to get other key workers their driving tests quickly, those in the Foreign Office who repatriated thousands of British citizens from abroad, and I personally thank them. We cannot forget them all, and especially the workers in HMRC who got that furlough scheme up and running, and the DWP staff, friends of mine, who processed thousands of universal credit claims, some of those already on low wages. Public sector workers aren't asking a lot. They just want their contribution to be recognised. They were undoubtedly grateful for our applauses earlier this year, but it won't put food on the table. Buy new school uniform, keep the car on the road, or get to work on public transport. Claps don't pay the bills, and at the end of the day, we are here to represent them. And just looking around Westminster Hall today, you can see who really cares about this. Mr. Chair, thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-Petitions 306, 845 and 328754 relating to financial rewards for government workers and key workers. There's 40 minutes approximately until I intend to call the front bench spokespeople. I've got, I think, 11 speakers. So I'll start with a time limit of 4 minutes. If that should be anybody's short on time, it should just about do it. But if there are many interventions, I will have to reduce the time. John MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and I want to thank my honourable friend who has eloquently introduced the debate and covered most of the ground that most of us want to really emphasise, because I just want the Minister to realise that to get petitions on this scale reflects a depth of anger. Anger amongst those most affected, of course, the civil servants, but also their families and the whole community. And the depth of anger is because these are the people that kept this country going for the last 9 months. Round the corner from me, the DWP administering, as my honourable friend has said, the million more universal credit claims. HMRC, the Ealing office just down from my constituents, which the government's closing, administering all those claims to keep the businesses going, the furloughs, so companies weren't bankrupted as a result of that. And then also at Heathrow, when I was this morning on the picket lines, immigration and border control staff, 2 of whom died as a result of COVID. They're the sacrifices that these people have made. So no wonder there's a depth of anger. And the depth of anger is because it comes after 10 years of pay freezes and pay cuts. 6 years of a 1% pay increase, then pay freezes on top of that. We have an absolute epidemic of in-work poverty. 4 million people in in-work poverty, 70% of the kids in poverty and are in families where someone's at work. We're now talking about destitution within our country. And I just give this warning to the government. There's another pandemic coming. It's a pandemic of debt. 18 million people have incurred debts as a result of the pandemic in this last 9 months. Joseph Rowntree is saying just the scale of this debt that we've never seen before. Step Change has said, well, the figures are nearly 600,000 people, renters, borrowing to keep a roof over their heads. And I tell you what I was startled by is 100,000 people attempt suicide associated with debt every year. Joseph Rowntree said 60% of those on universal credit have just gone for a loan in this last few months. Why? To keep a roof over their heads, put food on the plates for their children as well. I am fearful of what's going to hit us next. And I agree, I don't want to hear the claptrap from ministers about comparisons with private pay. The House of Commons Library demolished that argument, but I find it ironic that actually this is a government that has privatised public services and now complaining about low pay in the private sector. There is a bizarre irony in that argument that government ministers use. But let me say this. My honourable friend is here, who was the Shadow Chief Secretary with me. What hasn't gone past us is the economic illiteracy of this. It's almost as though John Maynard Keynes was never born. What you don't do in a situation like this is cut wages, which cuts demand in the economy. The argument will be, well, the government's borrowing a lot. Of course you borrow in this situation to make sure you pay the wages to those people on low pay who do what? Who spend their wages to increase the demands and make sure we can get out of this downturn as rapidly as possible. So my advice to the Minister is straightforward. They need to get back round the table with the unions and start negotiating a decent pay rise. and actually take a lesson from the Chancellor Duchess of Lancaster, who before the Select Committee admitted having 200 bargaining units in the civil service was wasteful. Get back to one table, one negotiation, but about fairness of pay for those who've given so much over this last 9 months just to keep this country's head above water.
Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. It seems that we're in a loop with this government as far as public sector pay is concerned. In 2008, another attempt was made by the government to curtail public sector pay. 3 trade unions at the time, the PCS, Prospect and the FDA, expressed their dismay at the approach taken by the government. At the time it said, it is high time, at the time we said, it's high time the Chancellor recognise the human cost of his disastrous pay cap and commit to giving our dedicated civil servants the pay they deserve. We all remember that the coalition blamed the last Labour government for not being prepared for the world financial crisis, Labour's banking crisis as they called it. They said they had to get the public finances into shape, and public sector workers were the first on the list with a decade of pay restraint. Members will remember the rather silly comparison with fixing the roof while the sun shines. Well, the roof has well and truly fallen in, and so public sector workers will have to pay for it to be fixed, according to the government. Here we are in the worst crisis the country has faced on this government's watch. It was simply unprepared. Despite the hard work of the public sector, as my honourable friend referred to, 5.3 million people with a public sector pay bill of 190 billion, the government decides to pick on them yet again. For every 1% pay rise, it will cost around 1.9 billion in gross terms, which after tax and national insurance is about $1 billion. Yet again, an easy target, the same old strategy, set the public sector against the private sector, set parts of the public sector against other parts of the public sector. It's such a cynical approach. So here's an idea. There are 1,200 tax reliefs foregoing 400 billion, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Has the government bothered to look at any of them in detail, so perhaps they could give the public sector the break it deserves after 10 years of restraint? No. Very little work has been done. It can't be bothered because the public sector workers will pick up the bill for the government's incompetence. So let's take a few examples of how the government could be a tad more imaginative. Capital gains tax, relief for entrepreneurs, is qualifying disposals, 2.7 billion, although coming down. Tonnage tax, 100 million, my right honourable friend often referred to. Patent box, 1.2 billion. Relief, R&D relief, 2.2 billion, 300 million pounds worth of fiddles in that. I'll stop there because it gets a little bit tedious. I have a long list, a very long list. The government talks about incentivising people. It incentivises its mates all right, and the Minister will tell us that there hasn't really been any public sector disputes or pay rather problems. These people need a pay rise. I rarely ever, very rarely ever bring personal matters into this house, but I'll make an exception today. My daughter would have been 32 years old today. She died in a cycling accident 10 weeks ago. She worked at the Liverpool University Hospitals. Yes, the NHS, the public sector, as does my wife, her mother, her friends and her colleagues, as I did. She and our colleagues worked hard. They work hard. I owe it to all those who work in the public sector to come here today and to speak out for them. Without question, they deserve a decent pay rise, full stop. But in the light of the COVID crisis, it's time for some of those on the tax relief bung list, and that's what it's been called, take their turn.
Paula Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. I will start by thanking my honourable friend, the Member for Gower, for securing this vitally important debate today. And before entering Parliament, I had spent nearly my entire working life in the public sector. And I can assure honourable members and friends that during my 30-year local government career, morale was never worse than during the last decade. The austerity programme initiated by the previous coalition government, coupled with pay restraint, amounting to substantial cuts in real terms pay, brought unsustainable stress on public sector workers and services they provide. Average public sector pay is still £900 lower today in real terms than it was in 2010, and hardly a period of shining progress in the run-up to the biggest public health crisis in our country's modern history. And at the core of this unsustainability was the fact the public sector was never demanded to deliver less, quite the opposite. The drive for efficiency alongside the demand to deliver more with less severely hamstrung the capacity of the public sector to deliver the changes that were promised. And whilst my direct experience is in local government, the same is true right across the public sector. We simply cannot disregard the previous 10 years as if they never happened. Rather, they should act as the historical context for such debates like this one today as we look to the future. And honourable members and right honourable members will know that over half of all key workers are actually public sector workers. The race to the bottom has seen brand rishi divide up the public sector, because apparently not all are born equal, as some are awarded meagre pay increases whilst the vast majority are not. They even use new language. Pause instead of freeze is one such example. And the public sector is under no illusions. The photo ops on the steps of number 11 every Thursday evening were exactly that, a photo opportunity and nothing more. During summer, government went into a spin overdrive, announcing above-inflation pay rises for some of those public sector workers whose pay is recommended by pay review bodies. Government enacted those recommendations whilst leaving out those whose pay is not set by pay review bodies, namely local government workers, social care staff and thousands of junior civil servants. Whether workers received an uplift to pay a few months ago or not, the entire public sector are now set to be hit again for at least the next 12 months. This has left millions of key workers who continue to go above and beyond in the hour of our greatest need, facing another lost decade, and enough is quite simply enough. There's so many examples I could give, but I'd like to conclude by pointing out that the problems created by over a decade of pay restraint in the civil service have been compounded by the lack of a coherent pay system. This has led to huge inequalities within and across departments, with the gender pay gap standing at over 11%. So I would like to ask the Minister two things today. When will the civil service move to a national pay structure to address these inequalities? And when will all public sector workers be treated equally and rightly acknowledged with a substantial pay increase for the incredible work they do each and every day working on the front line? Thank you.
Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer, and thank you for calling me in this important debate, and thank you to my good and honourable friend, the member for Gower, for opening this important debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. Mr Stringer, in the time I've got, I want to talk about two particular groups of key public sector workers. I want to talk about prison officers and firefighters, both of which are key workers, key government workers. In relation particularly to the prison officers, they deserve our praise, recognition and respect for their bravery, as indeed do firefighters, not only during the pandemic, but year in, year out. As honourable members may well know, prison officers are banned from taking industrial action. It's a criminal offence to even suggest they should, for example, start working to rule. So in return for the loss of this most basic human right, the Independent Prison Service Peer Review Body was established in 2001 to make recommendations on pay. Recommendations the government agreed to follow in all but the most exceptional circumstances. Indeed, to encourage people to join and stay in the prison service, the Independent Prison Service Peer Review Body recommended significant pay rise for Band 3 officers on fair and sustainable contracts, with new modernised terms that have in effect created a two-tier workforce. 5 months ago, the government promised to consider this recommendation and consult with the recognised trade union, the Prison Officers Association, on implementation. However, on Thursday last, the government rejected the recommendation, claiming it was unaffordable and without having had any discussion with the Prison Officers Association. Prison officers are understandably angry and have accused the government of nothing less than pay betrayal. I understand that the Prison Officers Association intends to launch a legal action against this decision, and I hope that we'll receive the full backing of all honourable members in this place today. The prison service is clearly experiencing a crisis in recruitment and retention, especially of Band 3 officers, the main operational entry grade into the service. The review body calculates the cost of new recruits leaving the service after less than 2 years' service is around £30 million per annum. It's a wasteful and inefficient use of public money. That's why the peer review body recommended an immediate £3,000 uplift in pensionable pay to try and stem the rising tide of resignations. The government claim this is unaffordable. However, no exceptional circumstances have been cited to justify this decision, as is required. The government have indeed earmarked around £4 billion for a new generation of private prisons, yet they claim to have no money to pay prison officers. This is quite frankly an abuse of power, and it's an insult to people's intelligence. Mr Stringer, the situation is unfair and unsustainable, and our prisons suffer as officers vote with their feet and leave the service, taking with them valuable skills, knowledge and experience at a time when we need it most. The government must think again. Treat our prison officers with the respect they deserve and get around the negotiating table with the Prison Officers Association and make a fair and sustainable offer. I also want to mention the firefighters. I chaired a meeting in the FBU group this afternoon. They've had a pay freeze in 2010 and 2011, followed by a 1% public sector pay cap imposed for 6 years, from 2002 to 17. They have
Order. Okay. Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship in today's debate, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Gower, on his powerful and eloquent speech opening today's debate. I'm not sure that I will add any unique points in today's discussions, but some points bear repetition. The first is that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the people who've been delivering our public services during the coronavirus pandemic. Some of them are in public-facing roles, jobs that simply cannot be done from home, including social care workers, refuse collectors, firefighters, border control staff, people who've been working hard day in and day out, exposing themselves and their families to additional risks in order to help keep us safe, secure and well. But others have been working just as hard, but are often invisible. They're amongst the unsung heroes of this crisis. I think of the staff working at HMRC, administering the job retention scheme, or those in the Department for Work and Pensions coping with a huge influx of new universal credit claims. Their work was just as essential in helping to protect jobs and livelihoods. They were often unprepared and under-resourced to deal with this new sudden demand, but they stepped up, and of course there are many others. But their reward for this work is to be handed a real terms pay cut. Now, the Chancellor might try to use this softer language with talk of a pay pause rather than a freeze, but soft language doesn't pay the bills. Prices are set to rise by 1.4% next year, and I think many people will be even more shocked when they realise that their council tax bill is going to go up by 5%. And thousands of public sector workers will be worse off, including every single police officer, every single teacher and 90% of armed forces personnel based in England. For many of those workers, as many colleagues have already said, this is just the latest kick in the teeth, because public sector staff have already endured a decade of cuts in the value of their wages, with many seeing their buying power cut by almost a fifth between 2010 and 2020. Government ministers want to pit public sector workers against private sector workers, but it's all smoke and mirrors. Private sector wage growth has fallen behind this year, primarily as a result of furlough having previously run ahead. And according to the IFS, once the different profile of public sector workers in terms of experience, education and other factors is adjusted for, there's no difference in hourly pay rates compared to the private sector. The truth is, this divisive language helps no one. We all lose as a result of these proposals, and it's very noticeable that not a single backbench Conservative MP has dared to turn up here to defend them. Now, in Nottingham, 23% of all employees work in the public sector. That's significantly higher than the average for the East Midlands or Britain, although, of course, there are parts of the country where it's far higher still. When those workers' pay is cut, they have less to spend in local shops and with local businesses. Freezing their pay harms the local economy. It risks the jobs of the private sector workers employed in those shops and businesses. And at a time when our local high streets are suffering real damage, when small businesses don't know whether they're going to survive the pandemic, this pay policy is delivering a further blow to confidence and risks further weakening a weak recovery. The Minister should think again. We need action to save jobs, to rebuild businesses and get the economy back on its feet. Instead of cutting real wages, the government should be boosting them, particularly for the lowest paid. It's the right thing to do, ethically and economically.
Unusually, there have been no interventions, and some members haven't turned up, so I'm going to increase the time limit for backbench speakers to 5 minutes. Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you to the member for Gower for securing this important debate. This afternoon, I want to talk about the workers who, throughout this pandemic, have delivered furlough schemes, processed millions of new claims for universal credit, who've kept the courts, ports and airports open and our prisons safe and secure. When we as a nation applaud our key workers, these key workers are often forgotten, and worst of all, they've been abandoned by the government. Unfortunately, the words civil servant still conjures up visions of Westminster for many, including, it seems, the government itself. Nothing could be further from the reality. The truth is that civil servants have suffered years of real-term pay cuts. The average civil servant on a salary of £26,000 is now worse off by £2,110 a year compared to 2010. Since the end of national pay bargaining, there are over 200 sets of pay negotiations in the civil service and related areas. What that means in reality is that there are now huge inequalities in the pay of civil servants, with many falling into poverty pay. For instance, in HMRC, 12,000 staff, around 1 in 5, are paid the minimum wage or just above. It's unacceptable to have government workers forced into poverty. Then we come to another group of workers who so often get overlooked, prison officers. As the member for Easington has just said, they deserve not just our praise, but our respect for their courage in the course of their work, year in, year out. COVID has made a dangerous job even worse. In my constituency, we recently heard of an outbreak at HMP Frankland, where over 200 members of prison staff were off with COVID symptoms or self-isolating. This puts enormous pressure on the remaining staff. Yet, just last week, the government rejected a key recommendation from an independent body to raise the salaries of those on the front line. This is nothing less than a kick in the teeth of hard-working and loyal public servants. As other members here have pointed out, prison officers are banned from taking any sort of industrial action. I disagree with this limiting of their basic rights, but in their place, the Prison Service Pay Review Body recommended a significant pay rise for Band 3 officers. The government claim this is unaffordable, without justification or reason. And of course, we know where this all leads. Prison officers will vote with their feet and leave the service they love, losing valuable knowledge and experience at a time when we need it most. As experience goes down, violence goes up, leading to more officers leaving, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. Civil servants do thankless work. They don't want applause, just to be rewarded fairly for the work that they do. The government should listen to their trade union, the PCS, and start to restore the real value of their pay with a 10% increase. On prison officer pay, they should think again and listen to the Prison Officers Association and the Prison Service Pay Review Body. These aren't excessive demands. They're simply about keeping key workers' heads above water, giving them some decency, respect and fairness. Surely that's the least we can do.
Bus Cheryl and Bus.
Thank you, Mr Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I want to say thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Gower, for her excellent speech at in the introduction to this debate. In fact, all the speeches that we've heard today have been outstanding, and I associate myself with all the speeches we've heard so far. I also want to begin by thanking the 353 constituents of Enfield Southgate who have signed the 2 petitions which has led to today's Westminster Hall debate. And I also want to thank our public sector workers who have provided such an incredible public service, whether it be in our hospitals, in the social care sector, our local councils, our communities, our schools, our courts, prisons, across the whole justice sector, and also in our job centres and across the course of all those working in the emergency services in every public sector, which I've not had time to mention. These have been incredibly straining circumstances, but for their stepping up to help in this way, we would be in a lot worse situation. And I know from speaking to public sector workers that working in the sector is a vocation for many people, and they have a real desire to serve. And this is despite a decade of cuts and austerity and the huge pressures that have been placed upon people just doing their everyday job. I want to explode the myth that public sector workers get paid far more than private sector workers. That's simply not true. Figures from the ONS show that after years and years of below inflation pay rises and pay freezes, that according to their statistics, the ONS say that the public sector workers earn 3% less than private sector workers, and we need to make sure that that isn't forgotten. The government have chosen that rather than reward all public sector workers for their hard work, they've chosen to divide and rule and give some public sector workers a pay rise whilst giving a slap in the face to others, and that's clearly unacceptable. What the government don't realise is the huge amount of goodwill that public sector workers provide in doing their job under the most trying of circumstances. Prior to becoming a Member of Parliament, I worked in local government, and I worked with some extraordinary people who would often go way beyond the call of duty just to get the job done. And this was after years and years of cuts, not only in staffing levels that made their work extremely hard, but also in resources as well. And in my borough of Enfield, during the start of the pandemic, I helped volunteer to deliver food parcels. And that was arranged and organised by Enfield Council's amazing staff, who weren't doing their everyday job. This was an additional job they were seconded to do to help make sure that people who were in a dire need got the food that they needed. And that was an incredible achievement. They showed that they were stepping up to do that. So I ask in all honesty, how can the government justify not giving these public sector workers a pay increase? When the chips were down, our public sector workers did what they had to do to get us through this. And it's only right and proper that they get the reward that they deserve and not the appalling snub from the government.
Nivandu Mishra.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd like to start by thanking my good friend, the Honourable Member for Gower, for securing this important debate at a time when key workers have done so much on the front line of the COVID crisis to keep us all safe and our country moving. I'd also like to draw attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interest and particularly my trade union membership. As a former retail worker on the shop floor for 6 years, it's important for me to mention shop workers. Shop workers are key workers. If there's one thing that this pandemic has demonstrated, it's that the shop workers, cleaners, transport workers who are working at the coalface of this crisis are key workers who deserve our respect, but also fair pay terms and conditions. We must therefore look again at what support we give them. Recent research by Trade Union Congress suggests that 3.7 million key workers, that's 38% of all key workers, earn less than £10 per hour. That is not reflective of the service they provide and is why we must raise the minimum wage to £10 per hour at the very least, as well as put an end to unfair youth rates. Moving on to the civil service, the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington made this point that the current system of having over 200 sets of pay talks is hugely inefficient. When will the civil service address this poor practice by implementing a coherent pay system which covers all its workers through one set of centralised negotiations? Research by the Public and Commercial Services Union, which has done so much to bring this issue to the fore and whose petition has now received more than 100,000 signatures, revealed that in the past decade since the Conservatives entered government in 2010, civil service pay has fallen in value by up to 20%, with the average civil servant now worse off by more than £2,100 every single year. Not only is that unacceptable, it is also a completely unsustainable position for those who are earning less year on year. But instead of rewarding government workers and local government staff for continuing to deliver council services during the most challenging circumstances this year, there was a deep sense of injustice that the Chancellor instead used his spending review to announce a public sector pay freeze. The Fire Brigades Union, which represents firefighters who put their lives on the line for us on a daily basis, subsequently criticised the government for divide and rule tactics, which is understandable when the wealthiest corporations have been allowed to cash in on the pandemic without shouldering any of the burden. There must also be a new deal for retail, distribution and home delivery workers based around a real living wage as defined by the Living Wage Foundation, not the version this government has appropriated and guaranteed hours. As we've seen time and time again during this pandemic, it's imperative that we have a meaningful statutory sick pay. The current provision isn't fit for purpose and offers little support for those who are sick, having to self-isolate or look after loved ones. A good route for the Treasury to raise revenues by ensuring that businesses pay their fair share of tax by tackling tax avoidance and the use of offshore havens once and for all. For example, over the last 20 years, Amazon paid just £61.7 million in corporation tax, and that despite Amazon's UK sales surging more than 26% to almost £14 billion in just the past year alone. We cannot continue down a path where businesses can afford to pay out millions to shareholders but plead poverty when it comes to paying decent wages to staff members who created their profit and support our communities. While the government stalls on its support for workers, I'd like to take this opportunity to urge all workers to join a trade union and provide them with the protection and dignity they deserve. Thank you.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a privilege to serve under your chairship. And can I congratulate and thank my honourable friend, the member for Gower and the Petitions Committee for this debate. I also want to say thank you to my constituents who have contacted me about both public sector and key workers' pay, including 700 Jarrow constituents who have put their names to both petitions that we're debating here today. And as colleagues have already pointed out, we cannot let this descend into an argument about levelling down. There should be fair pay in both the private and the public sector. And we should not let this debate become a tool for the government to once again pit private sector workers against those in the public sector. We see it week after week in PMQs, the Prime Minister attacking the opposition for only caring or focusing on the public sector. The Prime Minister recently said that the Labour Party has a deep underlying hatred of the private sector. This, of course, is not the case. But I ask the Minister, how can public sector workers support private businesses if they cannot afford to buy their products or pay for their services? It simply makes no economic sense. This pay freeze for public sector workers comes on top of an 11-year pay restraint. 10 years ago, the government implemented a 2-year pay freeze, which was followed by a 6-year pay cap of 1%. And since then, average salary levels in the civil service have fallen in value by comparison with inflation. And as has already been said, but I think it's important, so I will reiterate this point, this means that the average civil servant on a salary of £26,000 is now worse off by over £2,000 a year. And hard-working civil servants in my Jarrow constituency simply cannot afford and frankly do not deserve a further freeze on their pay. A great number of the civil servants in my constituency are employed by the DWP in Newcastle. Many are administering benefits which are virtually at the same level of income as those actually receiving the benefits. How is this a sustainable situation? We all recognise the huge economic impact the pandemic has had, but it is public servants and key workers across the sectors that have kept the country running during this difficult time, and they deserve a pay rise, not a pay cut in real terms. Not only is the pay freeze unfair, it also makes no economic sense. Research from the New Economics Foundation found that paying all public sector workers a real living wage and increase in public sector pay would boost GDP by between 1.1 and £2.1 billion, with an increased tax take of between £370 and £700 million. There must be no return to the austerity programme implemented in the aftermath of the crash. 10 years of the flatlining economy has exposed the economic illiteracy of austerity, and a significant uplift in pay should be central to the post-pandemic recovery across all sectors of our workforce. And yes, we need to thank our public sector and key workers for all that they have done throughout this crisis and beyond. But I say to the Minister, thanking them and clapping them on doorsteps, etc., is not enough. They simply need a pay rise. Thank you.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak briefly here in Westminster Hall. And I'd like to congratulate my good friend, the Honourable Member for Gower, on securing this important debate. A debate that reflects her long-held commitment to working people, and I thank her for it. Mr Stringer, the people of Newport West work hard, and they look out for their neighbours, and where they can, they help out. They never walk by on the other side. And that's why so many of them have been in touch with me in recent weeks and months, urging me to call on Tory ministers to act, and to act quickly. Act on what, some may ask? Well, they want ministers not just clap. They don't want nice words. They want real action to show those who are keeping our country going that we really care, and that we really do recognise their contribution in the most difficult of circumstances. Like so many in this House and across the country, I've heard from constituents who want this place to do what our public sector and key workers have done for us in recent months, to go the extra mile and show that we care. Before my election to this place, Mr Stringer, I worked in our National Health Service for over 30 years. Every day I saw people working to keep our communities safe and our people alive, and the very least we can do is give something back. As my honourable friend with the Gower illustrated, public sector workers have endured a decade of severe cuts in the value of their wages, with many seeing the buying power of their pay packet fall by almost a fifth between 2010 and 2020. At the same time, the private sector has also far outstripped the public sector, as private sector pay grew at between 2% and 2.5% per year during the 6 years of the public sector pay freeze and pay cap. And as my honourable member, honourable friend, the member for Enfield Southgate, who is no longer in his place, he's stated that the latest Office for National Statistics analysis shows that, contrary to the myths, public sector workers earn 3% less than private sector workers in comparable jobs. These statistics show the importance of standing up for and siding with public sector workers in these tough times. Like members on this side of the House, I will be doing exactly that. And it's important we do so because the government's latest pay policy is set to heap further damage on public sector workers, as the forecast inflation rate for 2021 suggests that all public sector staff outside of the NHS will see a decline in the value of their wages, whether they receive their £250 payment or not. Whilst the government's pay policy should be opposed unconditionally, and I do so with the knowledge that many of my constituents do so too, there are still answers that ministers need to provide. Their rationale for the pay policy announcement was that the pay pause would protect public sector jobs. What measures and funding will the government be putting in place to ensure that jobs are not lost? And how is this objective being communicated to employers in the public sector? And I look forward to the Minister's explanation in her response later. I know that time is short, Mr Stringer, but I wanted to speak today to show our key workers that there are some in this place who care. And I join my honourable friend from Gower and many others in pledging to do all I can to stand with them and stand up for them in the opportunity I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. I'm really grateful to be called in today's debate and thank the Petitions Committee for prioritising such an important issue. And I too refer to my register of interests. We know that the petitioners have worked night and day to keep us safe over the last 9 months. And whilst they've had plenty of claps and slaps on the back, the Chancellor's statement came as a slap in the face when so many looked at their pay statements once again, realising that at the end of the month they still couldn't make the bills pay and the balances match. And as a result of that, it's absolutely right that we debate public sector pay in this place, because Britain does deserve a pay rise. And whilst I welcome a pay rise for NHS workers, we still don't have the remit, we still don't know